Mrs. Clara Davis had never expected anything extraordinary from her routine visit to the local grocery store. At 74 years old, she lived a simple life, one defined by routine and kindness. Every Wednesday afternoon, she would make her way to Miller's Grocery, the only store in town that had the freshest produce and a warm, welcoming staff. Her small home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, was filled with the sounds of old gospel music and the smell of freshly baked cookies. She had been widowed for over 10 years, and with no children of her own, she had dedicated herself to volunteering at the local church and helping out her neighbors. On that day, as Mrs. Davis entered the store, she did so with a friendly smile, nodding to the familiar faces behind the counter. She didn't know it, but that would be the last peaceful moment of her life for weeks. She wandered down the aisles, picking up her usual items: a loaf of whole wheat bread, a carton of milk, and a few cans of beans. She was halfway down the produce aisle, admiring the ripe tomatoes, when the door swung open and two officers stepped inside. The officers, Officer Harris and Officer Daniels, weren't much older than Mrs. Davis's grandchildren. Both were dressed in full uniform, their badges shining under the store's fluorescent lights. They stood near the entrance for a moment, scanning the store before their eyes fell upon Mrs. Davis. Their gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Ma'am," Officer Harris called out as he approached her, his tone cold and calculated. "We need to have a word with you." Mrs. Davis blinked, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't used to being singled out by the police, especially in her small town, where everyone knew each other. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We have reason to believe that you've been involved in a theft at this establishment," Officer Harris said, his eyes narrowing. "We're going to need you to come with us." Mrs. Davis's stomach dropped. "What?" she exclaimed. "I haven't stolen anything. I've just been getting my groceries. There must be some mistake." But before she could protest further, Officer Daniels stepped forward, his hand resting on the belt of his holster. "You've been seen acting suspiciously," he said in a dismissive tone. "It's best you don't make this harder than it needs to be." Terror began to settle in Mrs. Davis's chest as she realized that this wasn't some misunderstanding. These officers had already made up their minds about her. With one hand on her elbow, Officer Harris steered her toward the store's exit, and she had no choice but to follow, the cold floor beneath her feet feeling as though it were sinking with every step she took. The police station was only a few blocks away from the store, but to Mrs. Davis, the short ride felt like an eternity. Officer Harris and Officer Daniels exchanged few words, and the silence in the car was oppressive. Mrs. Davis tried to remain calm, but her hands shook and a cold sweat formed on the back of her neck. She had no idea what was happening or why they were treating her this way. She was an elderly woman, for goodness sake. What could she have possibly done? When the patrol car finally stopped, they roughly ushered her into the building, past the front desk, and down a narrow hallway. Mrs. Davis barely had time to glance at the other officers who worked there before they shoved her into a small, sterile room. The walls were bare, and the only furniture in the room was a metal chair placed in the center of the floor. They didn't bother to offer her a seat. "Sit down," Officer Harris ordered. She hesitated for a moment before lowering herself into the hard chair. Her body ached with every movement, but she held herself together, praying this was all a mistake that would be cleared up soon. "Please," she said, "I haven't done anything wrong." "Don't lie to us," Officer Daniels snapped, his face flushed with anger. "We know what you did. You stole money from the store." "I didn't steal anything," she insisted, her voice growing more frantic. "I don't even know what you're talking about." They ignored her protests, their eyes cold and uncaring. Instead of offering her a chance to explain, they began their cruel interrogation. "Why did you try to leave without paying?" Officer Harris asked, pacing back and forth. "Were you planning on pocketing the cash? What made you think you could get away with it?" "I didn't," Mrs. Davis started, but Officer Harris cut her off. "Enough with the lies," he shouted. "You're only making this worse for yourself." The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing minute. Mrs. Davis had never been involved with the law in her life, and now she was being accused of something she didn't do. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the officers, trying to find any trace of empathy in their eyes. But there was none. Instead, they stared at her with barely concealed contempt. As the hours wore on, the interrogation became more intense. Mrs. Davis's voice had grown hoarse from the constant yelling and the questions that were designed to confuse and break her. The officers weren't interested in truth. They were only interested in finding a way to make her confess. "How much did you take?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice suddenly quiet, as if to lull her into a false sense of security. "I didn't take anything," she cried, feeling the weight of their pressure pressing down on her like an iron vice. "Look at this," Officer Harris said, holding up a worn leather wallet. "It was found in your bag when we brought you in. Care to explain how it got there?" Mrs. Davis's eyes widened. She had never seen that wallet before in her life. "That's not mine," she exclaimed, her voice shaking. "I don't know where that came from. You're framing me." The officers exchanged a glance, and then Officer Daniels dropped the wallet onto the table with a smirk. "We'll see what the store says about that." Outside the walls of the police station, the small town began to stir. Word of Mrs. Davis's arrest spread quickly, and soon, concerned neighbors and friends began to ask questions. Detective Michelle Sanders, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience, heard about the incident through a concerned local reporter. Something didn't sit right with her about this case. Mrs. Davis had been a fixture in the community for years, known for her kindness and generosity. She couldn't fathom her committing such a crime. Detective Sanders began her own investigation. She visited the store and spoke to the employees who had been present that day. None of them had seen Mrs. Davis take anything, but they were too afraid to speak out. That's when Sanders decided to take a closer look at the security footage. What she found was nothing short of shocking. The video clearly showed Mrs. Davis walking into the store, picking up a few items, and leaving without incident. There was no theft, no suspicious behavior, no crime. With the surveillance footage in hand, Detective Sanders was able to make her case. She demanded an immediate meeting with the police chief, and after some tense conversations, she managed to force a full investigation into the actions of Officers Harris and Daniels. The town began to rally around Mrs. Davis. Neighbors, churchgoers, and even strangers who had heard about her ordeal came forward to offer their support. Protests were organized, demanding justice for the elderly woman who had been wrongfully targeted by two racist officers. In the courtroom, Mrs. Davis finally had the chance to speak. Her voice quivered as she recounted the abuse she had suffered, the cruel interrogation, and the false accusations that had nearly destroyed her life. But Detective Sanders was there to back her up, presenting the undeniable evidence that proved her innocence. After weeks of pressure, the case finally went to trial. Officer Harris and Officer Daniels were both fired from the police department and charged with misconduct and abuse of power. Their actions were condemned, and the town began to heal. Mrs. Davis, though scarred by the experience, found solace in the support of her community. The police department issued a formal apology, but the damage had already been done. Still, Mrs. Davis found the strength to forgive, knowing that true justice had prevailed. The story of her wrongful arrest became a turning point in the fight for police reform and accountability in the town. It was a painful chapter in the community's history, but it was also one that would lead to change, a change that would make sure that no one, especially an elderly woman, would ever be unjustly targeted again. As the dust settled from the trial, the town was left to pick up the pieces. The outpouring of support for Mrs. Clara Davis had been overwhelming, and the community began to rally for greater accountability within the police force. The incident, although painful, sparked much-needed conversations about race, abuse of power, and the vulnerability of the elderly in the justice system. In the weeks following the trial, the town's leaders met with community organizers to discuss police reform. The local police chief, who had initially been reluctant to acknowledge the wrongdoing of his officers, began to take the matter seriously. There was talk of mandatory racial sensitivity training, stricter oversight of police conduct, and reforms aimed at preventing the abuse of authority. For Mrs. Davis, life slowly returned to normal, though she was forever changed by the traumatic experience. She received countless letters of support from people across the country, some even offering financial help or asking for her story to be shared in the media. She was reluctant to share her pain any further, but she realized that her story had become an example, one that highlighted how a single unjust encounter could ripple through an entire community. She spent her days volunteering at the local church, just as she always had, but now there was a renewed sense of purpose in her work. She knew that her strength, her unwavering belief in truth, and her determination had helped to change the course of her town's future. The consequences for Officers Harris and Daniels were swift but thorough. After being fired from the police department, both faced legal action. Officer Harris, whose actions were particularly brutal, was charged with multiple counts of abuse of power, false imprisonment, and racial discrimination. Officer Daniels, who had participated in the abuse but had been less overtly hostile, was also charged with misconduct and had his police certification revoked. The trial for the officers was highly publicized, and both men found themselves isolated from the community they once served. They attempted to argue their way out of responsibility, claiming that they had been following procedure and that their actions had been justified under the circumstances. However, the evidence was clear, and they were found guilty of misconduct. The community's response to their downfall was mixed. Some felt that justice had been served, while others lamented that it had taken so much for the truth to come to light. Regardless, there was a growing sense of accountability in the air. The town had seen firsthand the damage that unchecked power could cause, and it was determined to ensure that something like this would never happen again. As the town moved forward, many began to see the importance of standing up against systemic injustice. What had started as an isolated case of abuse had grown into a larger conversation about the need for police reform, racial equality, and the protection of the vulnerable. Mrs. Davis, though exhausted by the experience, became an unlikely symbol of resilience. Her bravery in the face of injustice inspired others to speak out when they were wronged, no matter their age, race, or background. In an effort to further the cause of reform, a local nonprofit organization was founded in her name, dedicated to promoting justice, advocating for the elderly, and providing resources for victims of police misconduct. The organization quickly gained momentum, and within a year, it had expanded beyond the town's borders, touching lives in neighboring communities and inspiring nationwide conversations about the treatment of marginalized individuals in the justice system. Several years passed, and the town of Hillcrest was forever changed. The police department, once an unchallenged institution, now operated under stricter guidelines, with transparent practices and community involvement. The reforms that had been initiated after Mrs. Davis's ordeal became a model for other towns across the country. Mrs. Clara Davis, now in her late 70s, lived quietly, but with a newfound peace. She still attended church, still baked her famous cookies for the neighbors, and still lived a life of grace and kindness. Though the scars of her experience remained, she no longer saw herself as a victim. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those who found themselves under the oppressive weight of systemic injustice. One sunny afternoon, as Mrs. Davis sat on her porch, a young reporter from a local news outlet arrived at her door. She smiled warmly at the reporter, who introduced herself as Sarah Miller. "Mrs. Davis," Sarah said gently, "I'm writing a piece about how the town has changed in the years since your case. I was hoping you could share your thoughts." Mrs. Davis paused for a moment, her gaze softening as she looked out across the town. The memories of that dark time seemed distant now, though still fresh enough to remind her of how far she had come. "I think," Mrs. Davis began slowly, "that sometimes the greatest strength we have is in the silence after the storm. The world may seem broken, but there's always the chance for change, for healing. And change, well, change begins with each of us in our hearts." As she spoke, the reporter scribbled down every word. But it was the quiet strength in Mrs. Davis's voice that would remain in the hearts of everyone who heard her story. And so, the legacy of Mrs. Clara Davis lived on, not just as the woman who had been wronged, but as the woman who had, through her strength, helped mend her community. See next video.